Niger's recent military coup presents problems far outside of its West African borders. A former French colony, it hosts French and US military bases and has even in the past helped the EU deal with its migrant crisis. So how worried should the international community be? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, following the overthrow of the president of Niger, former colonial power France has been stern in its condemnation. Other global powers have too. But so far, words and threats appear to have had very little effect on this junta.
On July 26, Niger's Presidential Guard detained President Mohamed Bazoum and declared the National Council for the Security of the Homeland. The leaders of the junta said they had acted because of the deteriorating security situation and bad governance. It was the country's fifth coup since independence from France in 1960. The Economic Community of West African States, known as ECOWAS, cut ties and threatened military intervention if the coup leaders didn't back down. The United States followed by suspending $100 million in financial support. It still has around 1,000 soldiers in 2 military bases in Niger. The French government said it will not tolerate any attack on France and its interests. That's after protesters attacked its embassy, some waving Russian flags. Washington has suggested Russia and its Wagner mercenaries could look to take advantage of the chaos. Niger is in the Sahel, a region of Africa where Wagner has a significant presence, and an area suffering increasing instability. Are things about to get worse there?
Well, let's meet our guests. We have a fantastic panel for you today. Joining us from Johannesburg in South Africa is Marissa Lorenzo. She's an independent risk consultant covering the sub-Saharan Africa region. And in Dakar, in Senegal, is Oluwole Ojewale, security expert and regional coordinator for Central Africa at the Institute for Security Studies. In Saint-Malo in France, we find Jacques Relon. He is a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Now, before we speak to the panel, I want to hear from an American academic. He is Professor William Miles. He was on the ground in the capital, Niamey, just as the coup unfolded. And this was what he told us. This is what he saw.
Before the coup, it felt very normal, calm, hospitable neighborhood as usual. There was no indication, no tension that there would be any political turmoil. And so it came as a complete shock, both to residents, Nigerian, as well as visiting foreigners and expatriates. I have no evidence that Wagner is there now, and I am not aware of any other Russian presence. However, I do believe that there are proxies who very well may be benefiting from Russian largesse and who were furnished with the flags. I mean, you can't easily find a Russian flag in Niamey, the capital. I would want to know, how did they get there? Who purchased them? Who made the pro-Putin posters that the media has widely disseminated? I don't believe that that is all spontaneous on the part of Nigerians who have been Russophiles all along.
My first question is to you, Oluwole. I want to ask, why did this coup happen, in your opinion? Is it too simple to say that President Bazoum wanted to refresh the military leadership, get rid of these older generals, and they got him first?
Thank you so much. I think I will highlight about 4 factors why I think the coup happened. The number one thing is to underscore the fact that in these countries, whether Niger, Mali, or Burkina Faso, there has never been a concerted effort to consolidate democracy on the part of the elite in the country. What do I mean? For instance, in Niger, in the last 3 years, there have been 3 attempts for coup. One is about to succeed now, if we consider it successful anyway by our global standard. And in Mali, it has been similar experience. In Burkina Faso, there have been coup and counter coup. It implies that there is no concerted belief on the part of the elite that the only path to political power is through the ballot. That is the number one thing. I think the second thing is also the neighborhood effects, because it happened in Burkina Faso, it happened in Mali. Chad is also a military administration. It stretches to Chad, to Sudan, it stretches to Guinea. So I think there is also that possibility of neighborhood effect, because Niger was the only democratic war that separated these two coup belts of Chad, Sudan, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And I think the last one is the fact that I also think the president hasn't really consolidated well in terms of political power. Because of these three attempts, he hasn't really seen the need to probably remove certain disloyal elements within the military, within the elite force of the army. He kept them in power, and I think they checked him first before he could check them out. So I think these are some of the factors that actually contributed to the coup. The fourth one, which the military junta continued to hammer, to emphasize, I think it's a whole lie, a bunch of lies to say it is because of the deterioration of the security that they have actually hijacked the political power in the country.
Marissa, the coup leader, General Chiani, says that this is all about helping the poor people in Niger who've been neglected for decades. Is it really a case of protecting the privileges of the military elite like him?
That is more than likely the case, but I think in any instance, it's just far too soon to tell. With any of these military coups that we have seen in Africa, like my co-panelist has just pointed out, they're still in early days. There hasn't been this consolidation of democracy. So I think we are being fair when we are skeptical, that these military leaders will suddenly now deliver what the people haven't been getting for decades and decades. But yeah, essentially it's very, very unlikely. But again, it's too soon to tell how they are going to rule. I mean, I think only now really a cabinet has been announced, and we will just have to wait and see. But the prospects are not looking good. I think we have seen enough of this globally, not just in Africa, to see that instability begets instability. And we can only really have proper development and real democracy if we strengthen institutions and if we are really committed to good governance.
Jacques, the coup seemed to happen like a lightning bolt, a coup de foudre, if you wish. Tell me, what was the reaction in France?
The reaction in France, in the population, is fairly muted. It seems to be far away. It's not a big topic of conversation. The reaction in political circles had been one of shock and awe, I suppose, because it is the problem. Niger was actually the linchpin of France's and Western, not just France, Western presence in the Sahel, along with Chad, but it's a crucial, Niger is a crucial element in that. Niger is central. Niger is surrounded by 7 countries, it borders with 7 countries. Jihadist groups are very active in parts of Niger. Also, Niger has a border with Libya, which the Americans are watching over very carefully. So, and Niger is seen as almost the last rampart against the spread of unrest and jihadist violence. And it would be seen as kind of creating an instability in this very volatile region, which would be damaging not just to the countries involved and the population involved, the population of these countries, but also to the states south of there, to the states bordering, the states on the like the Ivory Coast, Nigeria, which are the real economic powerhouses of there and who are still friendly to the West. And unrest there, unsettling of the regimes in West Africa, from Senegal to Benin, would actually be very detrimental to Western interests, and especially to Europe also, which is, as we know, the backyard to Africa.
Olawale, President Bazoum's election 2 years ago was the first peaceful and democratic transition of power since 1960. And it ends like this. How damaging has that been?
I think this is going to take the country back to the dark ages of clamping down of civil liberties, freedom of expression, even mustering of economic rights, because the Commonwealth, as we have seen in terms of the experiences with other countries that have been ruled by military junta in the recent time, is only going to be circulating within a very small cartel of soldiers. And dividends of democracy is not going to be trickling down to the people, because a small elite of soldiers have actually captured the power. So I think it's a major setback for democracy in the region, particularly now that the coup bet has now been completed from Guinea to Sudan within the region.
Marissa, what do we know about General Chiani and what are his plans?
So at the moment, not very much. I think that what is going to be his main focus is really just on consolidating this power. So anyone that seizes power through a military coup is, of course, very, very vulnerable. And this is really the reason why military coups do not generally bring about a better life for people, because effectively they are not really concerned with things like democracy, or they're not concerned with things like development. They're very much concerned about how they are going to stay in power. From what we've heard so far, I would call it quite populist rhetoric. It's just about, we're going to kick out countries that have had a damaging effect on our country or our democracy, or these countries are the reason why socioeconomic challenges are like that, and our resources must be for ourselves. But I don't think that there's really a clear way forward at present, and that's not really surprising, because again, even though I said it is too soon to tell, it is more than likely that we're just looking at power going from one elite to another.
Jacques, how much of all of this is France's fault? A failure of French foreign policy, if you wish?
In a part, it is, yes, certainly. It is a failure of French policy. In the past, the France-Afrique has been a blemish on relation. France was controlling most African countries for a long time, governments. France turned a blind eye to the corruption, which is endemic in these countries, and France is accused of having double standards. For example, they say they are there to defend democracy, but when President Idriss Déby died, France was quick to come to intervene and to put his son back in place, because his son was seen as to be very friendly to France. So therefore, there is an idea, and that's why it has created a resentment among the African population, who have started seeing all their problems emanating from French influence. And they also have seen that France, in spite of all its military involvement in Mali especially, haven't managed to contain jihadists. So it has led to accusations. And let's not forget also the role of Wagner in influencing on the cyber network. I've started looking at TikTok, and it's amazing the number of messages accusing France of all evils, and claiming that this new army, these new military leaders in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are giving back their confidence to the African people, who are fighting for their sovereignty against the nasty French occupiers, and also the exploitation by the West. They accuse them of pillaging their natural resources, etc. So that has created, governments are not working, they're corrupt, they're in cahoots with Western interests. Therefore, what we need now in order to solve the economic, social, and security problems of this country is a return to military rules, because the militaries know best, and they are the ones in charge of the patriotic interests of this country.
Olawale, can I ask you, did France meddle too much in the political life of its former colonies in West Africa?
I think that has long been established in history, because France departed the continent but didn't grant full autonomy to some of these countries. the economic interest, the fiscal interest in the country are still largely tied to France. So, in fact, in some countries, there are rumors that as far as appointing ambassadors, as far as making political appointments into cabinet, that France get involved in meddling with the affairs of some of these former colonies in the region. And I think this is what is actually funding the anti-French sentiment now, that the junta are actually using to capitalize and then consolidate their hold and gain and buy the legitimacy from the people. So I think these has long been entrenched in the francophone countries of West Africa and the relationship that they have with them pre, during, and post-colonial. They continue to remain tied to the umbilical cord of France. And the new generation is emerging that probably is looking for alternative way to actually decouple from France. And that is what is actually playing out now, even though it's not a justifiable reason for the recession of democracy in the region, but the junta are actually capitalizing on these.
Let's bring in Marissa. Marissa, is this all about French failure and its foreign policy?
I mean, no, I think France is a part of that story, but it's not the whole story. So I think, I mean, we can certainly agree that colonialism and the immediate era post it, so I guess your kind of neo-colonialism, which is when France was, no longer had its colonial government, but was still very much involved in these economies and dictating these things. Yes, certainly that has been very destructive. And I think what we are seeing here with the spate of coups that have happened in West Africa and that have mentioned their country's colonial past is that we're really seeing a kind of dissatisfaction with what we thought the post-colonial Africa would look like. So I think that there was this great hope for this economic revival amid political freedom. And I think that that just effectively hasn't happened. Now, these countries were always going to go through a very difficult time, especially when the former colonial government hands over power in such a way that it does benefit them. But we can also say, we haven't really had good leadership across post-colonial Africa, including in this sub-region where we have had the spate of coups. And that's because some leaders have been quite happy with the status quo. They've been happy to take what they can get and not really entrench democracy because that would put them at a disadvantage. And I think until we get better leaders that are able to dictate these terms and to say we don't want this kind of foreign interference, we want to be able to dictate our own future, and until they root out corruption and put in place strong democratic institutions, these problems and these socioeconomic issues that people are dissatisfied with, they're not going to go away.
Well, talking of the future, Marissa, the world is watching Niger now, and Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has said he fears Russian mercenaries could turn up next. Let's just have a listen to what Blinken said.
For sure, we have concerns when we see something like the Wagner Group possibly manifesting itself in different parts of the Sahel. And here's why we're concerned. Because every single place that this group, Wagner Group, has gone, death, destruction, and exploitation have followed. Insecurity has gone up, not down. It hasn't been a response to the needs of the countries in question for greater security.
Jacques, how concerned should we be that the Wagner Group and Russia will be looking at a resource-rich country like Niger, all of that uranium, and they will move in there next?
Wagner likes to pay itself off the land. And they've done that in Central African Republic, where they have been here for now 6 years. And they're mining the gold, mining the diamonds, and keeping the junta in power. In Mali, there are resources also. But I think, and in Burkina Faso, and we know that they basically pillage this country without any account to anyone. But their role there is more to protect the junta in power. Their fight against jihadists is not very successful. The UN just published a report saying that the number of blunders, of murders, of rapes of civilians has gone up. And well, actually, in Niger, in the last 2 years, with Bazoum having a kind of a milder approach with the jihadists and things, the the violence went down quite evidently.
Olawale, do you fear that you're going to see a joining up of Russian influence, swapping out one colonial power, France, and Russia coming in and having a foothold in Mali, Burkina Faso, and next Niger? Is that a serious concern?
Yes, it's a serious concern. And what we need to emphasize here at this point is that the entire instability in the Sahel now, with this new coup and the previous ones, has actually places the Sahel in the crossfire of geopolitics now. And that is the reason why the West is not going to give up. I mean, the Western Alliance. And Russia has suddenly seen an opportunity. Putin invited the junta leader in Burkina Faso and Mali to the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg. And I'm very sure he will want to add General Tiani to it now.
Marissa, is this Russia's next port of call that they will move into Niger?
I think it's too soon to tell for sure. I think that it could be. I mean, we have seen that Russia is trying to get as many allies in Africa as it can, because at the moment it just doesn't have very many. But I think that we do have to be very careful not to overstate Russia's influence in the region. So, Russia has not really been able to offer most African countries very much in the last few decades. Mostly its trade with African countries just consists of importing armaments. Of course, there has been a kind of revival or reach out to Russia from countries like Burkina Faso and Mali. And for sure, we could see the new military government in Niger perhaps also reach out, not wanting to be isolated, from the rest of the world, and then seeing an opportunity in Russia, and then Russia also seeing an opportunity there. But I think we also need to remember that Russia doesn't have that kind of power to be able to control governments completely. If it were me, I would be watching much more closely. What are these governments saying? What are they doing? How are they moving to consolidate their power after these military coups? Because they're in a very unstable position at the moment. And what's going to happen when they don't deliver on these massive socioeconomic promises that they've been giving these very desperate populations? How then are these populations going to react? Because we've seen very frustrated populations, but we haven't seen popular uprisings. These are military coups. These are groups of elites, small groups of elites that are effectively taking over government. But what's going to happen when you do have populations that do grow frustrated now with government after government that is failing them? And then you have pockets of insecurity, you have pockets where the state is absent, which is where terrorists have been able to, or terrorist groups have been able to infiltrate. So I think it's those kinds of actors that are much more important and much more relevant towards the kind of political landscape and security landscape going forward.
Jacques, I want to ask you about France's energy in the future. 70% of France's energy comes from nuclear power. And for nuclear power, you require uranium. And much of France's uranium comes from Niger. Is there a concern in 5 years and 10 years that France is going to struggle to get uranium, given that the relationship is not going to be great with Niger anymore?
None. No concern at all, because actually Niger provides only 14% of the uranium used by French power stations. Now, France buys uranium on the open market. The biggest supplier is Kazakhstan. You have Australia also. So uranium, okay, the main concern for France is the security issue in the region, the spread of jihadism, which would kind of contaminate the whole of West Africa, and also the result of the instability which the Russians are trying to promote in the region will lead to migrations. And obviously, people will not migrate to Moscow, they will migrate to Paris or Spain or whatever, to Western Europe. That's why France is not the only European country involved in Niger. The Germans, the Italians, and the Belgians, as well as the Americans, who are very concerned about what's going to happen to the countries where they are friendly to them, have a very big presence in the region, almost as in Niger, more than 1,000 soldiers, where France has around 1,500 soldiers. So the issue there is really an issue of security against the issue of the war against terrorism, which has not been very successful up to now, we can say, and it has not been successful anywhere, and the subject of the instability in a region which is already suffering from global warming, the misery of the population, which will create a mess. And at the same time, we see that Russia is not the only country challenging the West in the region. There's actually a new scramble for Africa, where Africa has become a treasure chest with rich soil, poor people, corrupt governments, in which it's possible to do business. France's economic interests in West Africa have dwindled down. At the moment, China, for example, trades more with Western Africa than France, the US, and Germany put together.
Jacques,
so,
thank you very much for your insight. That is it. The clock has beaten us. To Jacques in France, Olawale in Senegal, and Marissa in Johannesburg. Thanks to all of our fantastic panel for joining us. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.